Welcome to the second half of this year's Wolf Humanities Center series on the theme of choice. I'm Sophia Rosenfeld. I'm a member of the History Department here at Penn and also the topic director for this series. And for today's program, which is co-sponsored by the Cinema Studies program, the Comparative Literature program, and also the Department of Africana Studies here at Penn, I'm delighted to say that we're being joined by two wonderful artists coming to us from their homes in New York City and Oakland, California, respectively. Risa Puno, joining us from New York, is a multimedia visual artist and sculptor whose work has been included in a number of important museum exhibitions in the last few years, but is perhaps best known for her immersive and interactive public art projects, including The Privilege of Escape, which beat out, I believe, 630 some odd other proposals to win Creative Time's first open call for artists, leading to a hot ticket event at the Onassis Center in New York and a lot of media coverage in 2019, and a number of interesting projects since then. And Margaret Wilkerson Sexton is joining us from California as a writer whose novel, A Kind of Freedom, got an unusual amount of attention for her first novel in 2017. And if you haven't read it yet, you'll see why as soon as you do so, including being longlisted for a National Book Award and winning the Black Caucus of the American Library Association's first novel award. And she has out also a more recent book, The Revisioners, 2019, that's also been met with much critical acclaim and a whole slew of other awards, which are too long for me to read right now. So I don't want to say too much about either of them ahead of time. For more biographical detail, you can see the program for today. But suffice it to say, if it isn't already obvious, that these are two creative artists who work in very different media, with very different styles, and with attention to very different subjects. Yet both, it seemed to us, had some pretty fascinating things to say about the theme of this year's Wolf Humanities Center, choice. And by that I mean their choices as artists, yes, but even more about how choice is connected to freedom on the one hand, and the weight of history and other forms of constraint, both structural and personal, on the other. And since Puno and Sexton have been generating a lot of buzz in the last few years, and yet may not be well known already to our audiences, we're delighted that they've both agreed to join us this afternoon for a conversation. So the plan is as follows. First, Risa Puno will tell us about, and hopefully also show us, some of her recent work, including The Privilege of Escape, and the ingenious ways in which it combines elements of game playing with serious reflection on philosophical issues. Then Margaret Wilkerson Sexton will read us a passage, or probably, I hope, an excerpt from her more recent novel, The Revisioners, and give you some idea of her own language as well as subjects. Then the three of us will have a brief conversation about some common themes and divergences. And then finally, we will be welcoming questions from the audience. All you have to do is use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please listen and participate in what promises to be a kind of fascinating view into the work of our two guests this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much to Wolf Humanities for having me. I'm super excited to be here and to be in conversation with you all. And so when thinking about choice, I couldn't help but think of my project from 2014 called Please Enable Cookies, where I took inspiration from how websites use digital cookies to collect information. So I decided to try using actual edible cookies to collect personal identifying information. So I basically baked and packaged 700 cookies in my one-bedroom apartment with the help of my friends and family, and made flavors like chocolate chili fleur de sel, brown butter rosemary snickerdoodle, pink peppercorn pistachio. It was for a fancy area of Brooklyn, so you know. And I even iced some of them with popular social media icons. This was 2014, so that's the old Insta logo. But in order to get them, people had to give me information like their email address, mother's maiden name, last four of their social security number, fingerprints, photo of their face. And each piece of information was worth a certain number of points. And each cookie was also worth a certain number of points. So you could combine info to get the cookie you wanted. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't know if anyone would participate. I thought I'd just be sitting there with like hundreds of cookies. But to my surprise, it turns out that people will do anything for a cookie. In fact, so many people were like, yum, I can't believe these cookies are free. And I was like, I can't believe you think this is free. But I ended up collecting personal identifying information from like over 300 people, right? Which brought to mind the question, at least for me, why do we make the decisions we make? Like in this case, how do we perceive the risk versus the reward? And but I think the choice isn't just influenced by our perception of the outcomes. It also depends on what we understand our goals to be. um, like a few years before that, I made a piece called Good Faith and Fair Dealing, which was inspired by contract law. And it was basically like a larger version of this classic game called Labyrinth. It's like a tilting maze game where you try to get your ball through the maze without it falling into a hole. So in my larger two-player version, both players have identical mazes, but it's up to them to choose whether they want to cooperate and get both balls to their respective goals, or to compete and sort of just focus on their individual agendas. So here, you can see a video of me and my friend trying to play cooperatively. But just as with contract negotiations, even when working toward a shared overall goal, you may end up in opposition while executing the details. So on the left, you can see a photo of the original handle placement for this project. Those were sort of like bicycle handles that sort of like extend into the base of the artwork. And in the first exhibition, almost everyone was like just fighting for physical control of the board. They were literally shearing the heads off screws. Like that's the photo in the upper right. And at the time I was panicking. I had like an impact driver hidden in my like tutu skirt during the opening. I was like freaking out. So after that, I decided to switch the handles. I actually used door handles and wrapped them in bicycle tape, and I mounted them directly to the tilting surface. And all of a sudden, no one was trying to overpower the other player anymore. It actually became a sort of litmus test for how well people communicate and work together. Like it was fascinating to find trends in the different types of relationships, like between roommates, co-workers, who, by the way, tend to be the best because they're like used to negotiating with each other, people who just started dating versus old married couples, like my parents. Hilarious. Like basically my mom would start and she'd be like, okay, so I think we should go here and then go here and then like maybe we try this, and my dad would just be like, whatever, and he would just kind of like do his own thing because that's just how they roll. But on the left there, you can actually see two identical twins who won the game without uttering a single word aloud, which was really, really impressive. And so I learned that if the players intuitively understand that the power structure is shared and that their actions directly affect the other player, they were actually much more likely to cooperate and work together, which is one of the many reasons why I believe that games can operate as metaphors for larger social systems, which is why I made The Privilege of Escape, which was produced by Creative Time and hosted by Onassis USA in 2019. And this was my escape room inspired public art project designed to address social privilege and systemic inequity. So, keeping it light. But my intent was to create a sort of experiential metaphor for privilege and oppression that didn't get like bogged down in language, and instead really focused on the mechanics and how they make people feel, because I thought that would be a way to actually talk about it in a productive way, like a way to help conversation. And so for those of you who don't know what an escape room is, by the way, an escape room is they're live action games where groups of people, usually like friends, family members, coworkers, are put in a room full of clues and puzzles without any instructions, and they have to collectively solve their way out of it before the time runs out. It's basically an extreme nerd sport, which I totally love because I'm a nerd. But the reason why I thought about making an escape room about privilege is because the concept of escape in and of itself is a privilege. Because the freedom to remove yourself from like harmful or uncomfortable situations often requires things like access to means and expectation of mobility and like the hope for more favorable opportunities. And not to mention paying money to have problems added to your life just for fun already makes the medium, like the very medium of escape rooms, about privilege. So when people arrived at the venue, they found themselves in the world of the Institute. They were cast as participants in a psychological study. So they'd come up to the actor at our reception and be like, "Hi, I'm here for the Creative Time project." And they'd be like, "You're here for the 1 o'clock study?" Be like, "It's an escape room thing by Risa Puno." "Yes, the 1 o'clock study." And so immediately they're like sort of immersed in this experience. So now I'm going to share like a 3-minute super spoiler video that basically summarizes the entire experience through the eyes of the participants.
At the Institute, as you know, we are dedicated to the study of behavioral science. Your objective is to complete as many of the exercises as possible within the allotted time, which is 45 minutes.
One of these symbols would be like a square with 4 quadrants, and those would be like
I got it. Wait. That would be T. Because this is C and 3.
Nice.
This is R. We have them all?
Thank you so much for participating in our study. If you would grab all of your things and head out this way, you can sit on the chairs closest.
Both groups had the exact same tasks, but the conditions in the room varied. In terms of performance, test group A completed 100% of the tasks with 5 minutes and 59 seconds remaining. Congratulations. Well done. And test group B completed only 90% of the tasks. 0 minutes and 0 seconds remaining. I'd like to start with group B. Please describe the conditions in your test room. What did you first notice when you entered?
The room was red the entire time.
There's only one light we could actually see color, but everything took a long time.
Like changing those blocks, we had to run every block to the light.
These don't look the same. Some are purple. Yeah, I think we do have some purple ones here. No, they're green. Okay. They're green. So we don't know if this is N or C. We'll assume it's N. Oh, sorry. It's not over here. Okay, so it might all be different symbols. So I think we're actually correct on that one. It's D. Yeah.
Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
How do you feel now that you know that group B was intentionally assigned a room that was designed to make the experience more difficult?
I do feel less proud of the accomplishment though.
Less proud?
Yeah.
I'm happy we were able to succeed or win or like finish first, but also like I would have to acknowledge and have to live with the fact that it's cheapened. You know, like sure I got it, but like I also had an advantage.
The fact that group B was given the oppressive condition of red light, it means that the normal full spectrum light in group A's room became your privilege. And in the next study, we are asking the question, if people find out that the game is unfair, do they work together to change it?
So that's pretty much the experience, summarized. And one thing that the test subjects also found out during the debrief is that they were divided based on their birthdays, which is an unchangeable detail about their identity, much like the amount of melanin in your skin or the shape of your chromosomes. And the actual birthday split was different every time, but we prioritized separating people who came together, like who arrived together, so that they would have to work together with strangers. And the key to this project, I believe, was having the participants describe and compare their experiences to each other. This way, we weren't telling them about the effects of structural advantage and disadvantage. They were hearing it firsthand, often from people that they know and care about, while having to look them in the eye. And the adjective most frequently used by Group A to describe their test conditions was normal. And 0 subjects in Group A ever noticed the spotlight in their room, the thing that like Group B basically had to cling to in order to complete the tasks, which basically highlights the invisibility of privilege for those who have it. And when they successfully completed all the tasks, Group A generally reported feeling proud of their accomplishments, victorious, and really smart. The most frequently used adjectives that Group B used to describe their test conditions, on the other hand, were red, difficult, and challenging. And even when subjects in Group B reported having fun during the experiment, most of the words they used to describe their test conditions were negative, especially compared to those of Group A. So of 460 test groups, almost 82% of groups in test room A completed all of the exercises, compared to less than 5% of groups in test room B who completed all tasks. And only 2 test groups, not 2%, but like 2 test groups in room B finished faster than room A. So basically, while it felt like a real meritocracy when they were playing, it honestly, total myth. And so Group A's full spectrum light is something that most people would expect in a game presumed to be fair, especially one where there was so much emphasis on matching colors. And since Group B had something that made it difficult for them to detect colors, the red light, Group A had an unearned advantage just because their birthdays matched our criteria. So while technically privilege doesn't guarantee a win, it certainly makes it a hell of a lot easier to play the game. Thanks for listening. And I'm going to stop screen sharing and pass it over to Margaret.
Thank you, Risa. That was fascinating and brilliant. And thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Wolf Humanities Center, for having me. It's a joy and an honor. I'm going to read today from the Revisioners, and that segues fairly well from Risa's presentation because I'll be talking about the privilege of choice. So the Revisioners tells the story of a former enslaved woman and former sharecropper, Josephine. And despite her tragic past, when we meet her in 1924, she's fairly privileged. She's thriving. She's living on this 300-acre farm. She's surrounded by family and friends, and she's relatively flourishing. However, it is 1924. She is a Black woman, and a white woman has just moved in next door. And this white woman is younger than Josephine. She's not as confident as Josephine, and she's looking for something sturdy to hold on to. So she tries to strike up this friendship with Josephine. And Josephine is hesitant at first for reasons that we understand. It's 1924. However, they ultimately form this cautious bond, which is later upended when Josephine learns, and the reader learns, that the neighbor is a member of the KKK. So then fast forward many, many generations, Josephine's great-great-great-granddaughter, Ava, is a biracial woman living in New Orleans. She's strapped for cash, and she decides to move in with her wealthy white grandmother in her grandmother's uptown New Orleans mansion. So at first it's a win-win. Her grandmother is sick and she needs the money, so she's able to help her and she's able to not pay rent. However, the grandmother's behavior becomes increasingly erratic and even racist. and Ava's, the great-great-great-granddaughter's storyline, and Josephine's, the great-great-great-grandmother's storyline, threaten to converge. So I'm going to read from Ava's section first, and then I'm going to read from Josephine's section in 1924 when she's in her 70s, and then I'm going to read from her section in 1855 when she's a little girl and she's still enslaved and she's living on a plantation. And I'm just going to talk for a little bit between readings about each character's different relationship with choice. So I'm starting with Ava's section. This is the first chapter of the book, actually. And Ava is, she has just decided to move in with her grandmother, and they're literally getting out of the car, walking into the house. "We better go in," I say. "It's getting dark." And King lets out a tired sigh. "Why can't we just go to Mama's?" he asks. He's been asking this all week, and I repeat again what I've been saying. "This is a good opportunity for us, King. A better school. We'll see each other more because you'll just be downstairs." "Yeah, but living in this old lady's house, this old white lady," he pauses. "It's weird." "No weirder than living with Mama that one time. Probably better because she won't be all up in our business. Plus this house is huge. Grandma Martha will have her wing, we'll have ours. You probably won't even see her." He sucks his teeth, but he shifts in his seat and grips the handle of his backpack. When I open my car door, he opens his too. We didn't pack a whole lot. Our furniture is in storage, and otherwise we don't own much more than our clothes. One lamp, some framed pictures of me and my mother when I was a child, me clinging to her waist like any minute someone might snatch her. We gather the little we can hold and walk up the long brick walkway, past the two-tiered angel fountain in the courtyard, through the iron lace gate. I use my key to open up, and Grandma Martha isn't at the door to greet us, but she's already told me where we'll stay, and I know my way to the second floor. Her room is just beyond us on the third. King has never been inside, and his mouth is open as he sizes it up. The grand crystal chandelier, the red upholstered chairs, the oriental rugs over the mahogany floors, the paintings of her ancestors, their thin lips pressed together. In his room, he sets his backpack down. Just to the side of his four-poster bed, a window looks out to the driveway where our beat-up white Camry seems out of place. The bed is the height of his waist. I remember at our apartment, he'd flop on his old one after school, and here he has to climb on top. "I told you the house was big," I say. "Too big," he says back. "Too nice. I don't even feel comfortable touching anything." I almost tell him he's right, that he shouldn't touch a thing, but I want him to feel at home here. "You're careful enough," I say. I hear a voice behind me. "You don't need to worry about this old stuff." Grandma Martha. I turn to greet her, and she is how she always is, bracelets clanging and perfume wafting, an iron white button-down shirt and colored pants, and smart sandals with her toes painted a mild shade of pink. She is 78, and her wrinkles are fine. Her hair clings to her scalp before it's clipped at the base of her head into a winding bun. But I can still glimpse who she was when I graduated from college, when she wore a cream St. John's suit with a matching hat, and even when I was 4, and she fed me squares of baker's chocolate on the balcony, not too sweet because I wouldn't want to lose my waistline. "Oh," I say, and a shot of relief flows through me because she has that way of putting me at ease. We didn't see each other much growing up. My daddy went on to have a gang of blonde-haired children, and I'd only know their ages through the Christmas cards each year. Still, Grandma Martha sought me out every summer, offered to pay for tennis and math and science camps. She'd arrange for my mother to drop me at her house, and there'd be a frilly Janie and Jack dress in my size, waiting on the daybed in the guest room. I'd change into it. Then we'd drive her olive green Mercedes to lunch at Mr. B's in the quarter. For holidays, she'd mail me envelopes addressed to Miss Ava Jackson with a crisp $100 bill and pink barrettes enclosed. Anytime I'd meet her, my mother would preach on the way over, remind me of what I already knew, not to put my elbows on the table, to take slow, small bites, to say, "Yes, ma'am," to never force my grandmother's hand, and I obliged, even though I knew Grandma didn't care about that stuff. I told my mother that, but she never responded. Once Grandma's husband passed, the attention ramped up. Grandma bought prom dresses and makeup tutorials at Lakeside Stilla Counter. And when I had King and my own husband started to drift, she watched the baby for me while I slept or got my nails done. She'd sit on the sofa in my modest 2-bedroom and fold his onesies like she hadn't had a housekeeper her entire life. Now she has more. A chef named Ben, a part-time nurse named Juanita who even walks her up and down the streetcar tracks when the weather permits. Still, she'd called me one Saturday crying. She was lonely. I'd settled her down, then I'd confessed I wasn't faring much better, laid off from my paralegal job, and she proposed I move in. A win-win, she'd said, a win-win. Though at 78, she is not who she has been. She walks with a limp, she wears Depends, and not just at night, but she's always seemed mentally sound. She dresses and feeds herself, and she still has that softness to her that makes me want to tell her my secrets. She still makes me feel welcome here, and finally, like I made the right decision. So I picked this passage because, you know, there's an explicit decision being made here. Ava in 2017 is able to decide whether or not she wants to move in with her grandmother. And even if the decision is loaded, and even if, as we learn, you know, later on in the book, the decision has potentially dangerous consequences for her and her son, it's still her decision and she can leave at any time. In 2017, she has that luxury. So I'm going to move on to 1924. And this is Ava's great-great-great-grandmother. And remember, her neighbor has just moved in. So her neighbor's trying to get to know her. So she keeps coming to her house. And this is the second time she's tried to visit. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, she says. What is it? She catches me off guard, though I can't have the nerve to be surprised. White women don't sniff around Black women's kitchens too long before they set their sights on something they can take, something they have got to have. There's a rumor going on around you. My husband's the one who put me on it. He said you're some kind of conjure woman, said everybody around these parts knows about it, said a lot of the people who come in and out here are coming for that very reason. I pause. It is the strangest thing. The moments that call me to miss my daughters can't be timed. I had been close to them both, but it was the oldest whom I thought would be my forever child. I had to press her small body to mine the first time she used the outhouse. She was so afraid to try new things. She learned to beat the white women's clothes with sticks, fold them, then carry them in wheelbarrows for me when she was 3 because she didn't want to leave my side. She slept with me every night after her father passed, and she would have stayed too. But her husband was itching for a way out of Jim Crow, and his brother was moving to Philadelphia, and what could I say? She writes me every week, and she is happy with her 2 children. I would have liked to hold them just once, but what else can I want for her? I could water my entire farm with the lies people tell, I say. It wouldn't be the first time my husband got something wrong. Don't tell him I said that. I won't say a word, I say, and we both laugh. Because if he was right, I was going to ask you about the baby. If you could put one inside me? Here we go. I don't say a word. Just stare back at her, transfer some of the discomfort she lit up in me right back over to her. Sure, used to be. There was a time when I could say yes. When I first got here to bind my mother to me, I unfolded a picture of her from my breast pocket, laid it out over my prayer table along with her pearl comb. I burned sage and dressed a blue candle in sweet oil. Wasn't just that. People came from all over to relieve the weight of their hearts. Most times I didn't say a word, just sat there, listened to them wail about their daughter's face, snatched just before the war, and they couldn't call it up any longer, or guilt. And the more of it there was, the worse things people did to snuff it out. The whole while I was writing out prayers on their behalf, I was standing over a pot of my mother's favorites, stewed gizzards. I was nurturing visions of her every morning, chanting her name like jewels on a necklace. But Link came back more than once with an empty hand, and the last time, the very last time I had her searched, I burned all the sage, the cloth, the comb. I couldn't bring myself to destroy her image, but it sits at the back of my dresser now, and I'm too carved out to pick it up. But you said you don't do that sort of thing? The white woman repeats herself. No, indeed, I say, and I don't say another word more. So that's interesting because this, you know, it's 1924, and Josephine in that moment thinks she has the ability to say no to this white woman. she has the memory of her enslavement. And I think the memory of that enslavement is actually juxtaposed with the reality of her situation now, kind of fueling her belief in the illusion of her freedom. And she says no, and she thinks that's going to be the end of it. You know, the reader knows as the reader goes on that that's not the end of it. And there will be devastating consequences based on that conversation alone and based on that decision alone to refuse to help this woman. But there's the capacity for the illusion of freedom in 1924. So I'm going to move into 1855. And in 1855, Josephine is a little girl. She's living on a plantation, and her mother is the midwife on the plantation. So her mother's the only person on the plantation who's capable of delivering babies, not just for the enslaved people, but also for the enslavers. And so she's delivering babies for the master and his wife, the mistress. And the missus has had several miscarriages. She's pregnant right now. And this baby actually was conceived through the help of Josephine as a little girl. But Winnie is the one who's capable of delivering the baby. And the missus is bleeding in the middle of the night. And so Winnie is called to tend to this situation because it would be far too early for her to have the baby at this point. Okay. That night, there was a banging on the door. Daddy was in the bed, holding on to Mama from behind. He didn't hear the knock, and it was Mama who stood up to answer. "Winnie, come quick, Miss is bleeding out," Vera shouted from the other side. Mama dashed for her sack and then sprinted off. I trailed behind her, but no one saw me go. We reached the house, then upstairs. Mrs. was moaning on the bed, and she reached for Winnie. "Not again," she said. "I can't do it again." Mama nodded and pulled back the sheet. "I'm sorry, Mrs., she said. "I don't care about sorry," Mrs. said back, and she started to wail. I could see my mother's hands from where I stood. There was a pool of blood beneath Mrs.'s bottom, and Mama lifted her to set down quilts. Then Mama reached up Mrs.'s pee hole. Mrs. gasped, but Mama kept going. I wondered if Mama ever thought about squishing Mrs.'s insides together, making her hurt. Mama held so much power in her fingertips. "Everything feels normal, Mrs., Mama said. Mrs. was relieved, but couldn't accept it. "But the blood," she said. "It happens sometimes. Happened with Josephine," Mama said. She still didn't know I was in there. "So everything's going to be okay?" Mama nodded. "You sure, Winnie?" Mrs. asked again between gasps. "Certain," she said. And I wondered how Mama could be certain of something so grand. Then she turned for the door. On her way to the stairs, she saw me and called me to her with her eyes, but she was not down one step before there was another gasp, this one louder, then a scream, "Winnie!" And Mama jerked back inside. There was more blood now, more than I'd ever seen, and I closed my eyes against it, imagined it halting, imagined the source of it all closing in on itself, and imagined that rocking chair tilting back and forth, and there was a baby boy in it, Mrs. holding him, a bonnet. I ran the scene through my head like a wheel turning over and over and over again. Mama was frantic. I could hear her panting and Mrs. moaning, the sounds mingling so I could barely focus, but I fixed the picture in my mind. It didn't take long for things to slow. Mrs. stopped screaming, and Mama's hands were on me. I opened my eyes. Mama was pressing me toward the stairs. I looked back at Mrs. It seemed her bleeding had stopped, but she stared at me like I had taken something from her, something final that would never be returned. As we walked down, I saw Tom at the foot of the steps waiting, gripping the rail so hard his knuckles were red, and he said, "You see to it she has that baby this time, Winnie." And Mama said, "By the grace of God." And Tom said, "I'm not talking about God, I'm talking about you, Winnie." Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. This is interesting to me because obviously it's 1855, they're on a plantation. Winnie and Josephine are both enslaved, and they have no choice, no agency in the matter of whether or not they will try their best to help this baby be delivered safely. And yet, despite the fact that they're so oppressed with regard to their choices, they have all this power. Winnie has all this power that the master of the plantation is projecting onto her, this almost divine power to oversee the will of God in deciding whether or not this child will be born healthily. And it's not only a projection, she actually is the only person on the plantation who's capable of making that happen. And so I think it's interesting because, you know, we understand that freedom and choice are there's typically a direct correlation between those two. To the degree to which you have freedom, that's the degree to which you have the agency to make decisions. And we see even in this book, as the generations progress and as freedom expands, the power to make decisions also expands with it. But there's not necessarily that same correlation directly between choice and power. And that's what I wanted to illustrate in this book. Despite the fact that Winnie is so hemmed in by the system of slavery, she still is the most powerful person in this regard on that plantation. And that power is in these characters and is in these women, and it's passed down through generations. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the rest of the discussion, but that was a major theme of the book. The fact that choices can be hemmed in, but that personal power cannot always be tampered with. Thank you.
Hello again, and thank you both. That was terrifically interesting in both cases. And so interesting also, I think, to see the very different ways that very different kinds of art can take up some of these problems. Both of you putting the audience in very different roles, using very different formal devices, using different media. And to start our conversation, I thought I would ask you both a little bit about your own choices first, and then we'll get back to some of the very pressing questions that Margaret just introduced at the end of her reading. And maybe I'll ask Risa first. I am very interested in your choice in the first place to think about being the kind of visual artist that creates participatory work in particular, and beyond that, work that is really very close to games in so many cases. And I wonder something about how you got started along this particular path, what your thinking was that led you towards this interactive, participatory mode as a way to, obviously a sculptural dimension too, but as a way to create some kind of meaning and expression.
Cool. Yeah, happy to answer that. My path was not exactly a straight one. I started out in undergrad. I was at Brown University in their 8-year medical program. I was like on my way to being a orthopedic spine surgeon. Like my research was in scoliosis. My summer job was harvesting spines from fresh cadavers. And so like, it was a very different path, but I had been so structured in like high school growing up, and that I didn't get to take art in high school. So I finally got to take it in college, and I fell in love with it, you know, much to the chagrin of Dr. Mom and Dr. Dad. Hey, parents. But they're cool now. We're cool. And so in that, I was just kind of exploring, right? Like I was just trying to learn stuff. I took like a drawing class, a painting class, and I really liked the way it felt to push the material around. But in terms of subject matter, I'm not good at coming up with like worlds and characters, you know, and things like that. Like I feel like I think of painters a lot like poets and writers, right? Where it's like really coming like from you, right? And so for me, I was much more sort of about observing the world as like around me. And so I started making sculpture, and that still felt like there was a separation because there's like the pedestal and it's like, don't touch. And so I started making installation like work. And then I started making interactive installation work. And then I started making public art because I really liked that it becomes a part of your everyday life, right? Like you see it all the time. Anybody can go and especially coming from a non-art background, like it was really important for me to try and generate points of access for people who don't have a background in art. And I think games do that, you know, it like makes it so that like, even if you don't know what this is about and you're not used to encountering art, especially interactive art, it's like there's already like a way to engage and a way to understand it. And then hopefully that leads to other things.
Yeah, it's interesting because games, of course, also have a lot of rules. So they also constrain you in various ways. I mean, I'm not much of a game player precisely because I can never master the rules. You know, so that's something maybe we might come back to. But thank you. And Margaret, it sounds like perhaps you took too a somewhat circuitous path perhaps to what you do, since I noticed that you are also have a law degree along the way. But I wonder in your case too, I guess in the broadest sense, about how you came to be a writer and a novelist, but even more specifically about the very interesting shape of the work you do. You don't use games, but you use this long historical framework in which you focus in closely, it seems, on individuals and families over generations, but then there's an enormous historical arc to both of your books. And maybe you could say something about both the larger decision and the more specific decision about what kind of fiction to write.
Thank you. So I identify with Risa because I was a lawyer. I always thought I would be a writer in the back of my mind, but I think as the time approached for it to become, a feasible decision that I would make, I think the doubt started creeping in. I started to see it as unrealistic. And so I went to law school and worked at a law firm for a few years. And it became pretty clear that wasn't the right path for me. It became clear pretty quickly. So anyway, I was able to shift gears. One of the things that I wanted to do in becoming a lawyer was to effect social change. And that's what I wrote my law school essay on. And I was serious about that. I, of course, ended up going to a law firm and not doing that through the law, but that passion and that desire still stayed with me. And so when it came time to write, it was an easy decision to pick topics and to even pick characters, but mostly topics, I guess, and messages that would resonate with that spirit of wanting to change the world. And so I'm always picking, whenever I start a book, I'm always thinking, what is the thesis of this book? And like for A Kind of Freedom, I believed that the thesis of that book was we had Jim Crow, and Jim Crow was abolished. And now it seems like everything is fine and things have progressed, and there should be the expectation of equal results, because now every demographic in the country is treated equally. And so my thesis there was, no, that's not the case. Jim Crow has been abolished, but we still have the war on drugs. We still have mass incarceration. And these are systems that were purposely designed to come in and do the work of Jim Crow in its wake. And so we still have this deep, deep inequity in society that's explaining a lot of the unequal behavior and deliverables between certain demographics. And in the Revisioners, it was similarly, the thesis was, I wanted to explain the discrepancy in voting patterns. I wanted to examine the discrepancy in voting patterns between white women and Black women in the 2016 Trump election. And I just wanted to retrace the history of and just look at the dynamics historically and see how it started, just to get to the root of it, so we could start to heal it, and just to kind of facilitate conversations like this one where we could start to even just talk about these issues so we can unpack them. So that spirit of wanting to effect social change is still there. Like I could have done it through the law. It's a better fit for me to do it through the writing. The historical component, it's interesting. I resonate with Risa on this too. It's easier for me to do historical fiction because I have trouble coming up with ideas. And I feel like if I don't, I'll have these very vague ideas, more themes than ideas, more themes than plot points, and I can't figure out how to turn it into a story that anyone would want to read about. So often I'll start doing research, and I'll discover characters, and I'll discover storylines that are based on what I'm reading, that, things that actually happen, and, they'll be warped by the time I finish with them, but that's where I kind of get the ideas sparked. And so it just works. And it's funny because the thing that I hated least about the law was the research component, or the thing that I hated most about the law was the research component. And now I have to do all this research for the writing. I didn't expect this, but here we are.
That's really interesting. Yes, I mean, in some ways, both of your work, if there's any point of similarity, it might be something around the idea that you both take up sort of large social and philosophical questions, but in ways that are unexpected because they're not sort of stated as philosophical statements, but they come out in different ways. And maybe I'll use that too, since Margaret, you set me up so nicely here for asking you both a question really about, in some ways you seem to both be tackling not just the question of freedom, but what success looks like and what makes it possible, and also what limits it, whether that be psychological or structural. Margaret, I love the way your characters sort of second guess themselves at various moments. And some of that is personal, but some of that is obviously the weight of other people's opinions or the weight of history in various ways come into play. And Risa, you have real life people making decisions in your work. So maybe it's something to ask you both. Maybe I'll start with Risa again, is to say, your game about escape is in a sense about privilege, but it's also about success, winning at something, which is interesting. And I'm wondering what you're trying to accomplish in part, whether you're trying to show the privilege that they have an advantage they don't often see and don't recognize, or are you trying to show the disadvantage that they don't recognize the obstacles in their way? And what does a rigged game end up accomplishing in terms of what kind of message you want your participants to leave with, since your audience is in a sense the same as your participants? If that makes sense as a question.
Sure. I'm going to see if I can keep track of all the thoughts that just like popped into my head. But yeah, so I mean, part of the game, it was to highlight the invisibility of privilege for sure. And part of it in terms of the goal, like the way I see success, I mean, honestly, in games in general, but then especially within this project, I saw the drive for success as a sort of tool, like a sort of narrative tool, a way to get people to an emotional goal. And so that's why a lot of things like competition are interesting to me, right? It's like, why do people want this? And why it feels good for some people to win over someone else. Like what would happen when people finished in the room with the full spectrum, or actually in either room, but it never really happened in the red room. But in the room with the white light, people would come out and the sound that would play was like this combination of, what was it? It was the Olympic anthem meets Price is Right, meets Pomp and Circumstance, meets fireworks and applause. Like it was like this cacophony, sort of like, and you were just so excited. Like we said, they felt like $1 million when they came out. They were like, yeah, we got this, high-fiving, like, blah, blah. And then they'd see the live CCTV footage of the other people playing. And I would hear them because I'm obsessed with watching people use the things. And so I was watching them, like 3,000 people do this. And so many people would look at the CCTV footage and be like, oh my God, they're so far behind. Oh God, we're so much better than them. My fiance is going to be so mad when they come out here and see that we won. Maybe we should boo them. Yeah, let's boo them after. And it's this like, there's this thing of feeling like you earned that, right? And like we must be better than them. Like, even though you can see on the thing, like the saturation was turned down a little, but it was like definitely not like white light in that room. And I heard somebody mention it once and they were like, wait, is it dark in there? And they were like, no, look, it looks like pink. We didn't have pink walls. It's not dark in there. And it's these things that we tell ourselves to protect our privilege. Right. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of the people that I essentially oppressed in the game, it was tricky because I had to make a choice in terms of preserving the invisibility of privilege. It's like when you're oppressed, generally it's not a secret. I mean, right. It's also different, right? Like growing up, I grew up in Kentucky, right? And as the daughter of immigrants of a quote unquote model minority, right? Like, I think that there were a lot of ways in which I'm still unpacking how that has affected me. There were lots of things that I thought were sort of personal failings of mine, and I'm now realizing were sort of systemic things. So in some ways, yes, you don't know, but like I knew, so I had to make a choice with this. And I figured the people who were coming were probably going to be mostly like people with some sort of social privilege, honestly, probably mostly white, right? And so I chose to center that a little bit in bringing up the invisibility of it. But I think in terms of how that relates to like success and what is success. So the thing is, people felt amazing, but then the minute they found out that like the other group had a structural disadvantage, I mean, like watching the myth of the meritocracy crumble on their faces was, I mean, I have like goosebumps literally on my face right now thinking about it. I mean, I felt horrible for it, but at the same time, that was like the point, you know? And so it's just, and then honestly, watching what people said afterward, I mean, most people said that they felt guilty or they felt relieved, you know, they felt like it was crappy that the other group had those circumstances, but they didn't want to have those circumstances themselves, you know, stuff like that. And so that to me is where the conversation got really interesting. And the way that the group in the red room would say, like before they felt bad, you know, they felt dumb, they felt slow, and now they felt validated. They were like 95% is awesome, all things considered. Like, why didn't you guys like get done faster? Like without this red light, we would have smoked you, right? And so it's just this. So I mean, I did want people to feel validated and seen, right? People who do experience systemic oppression.
It's very interesting because it sounds like the game itself, from what your description is, mainly is the impediments are mainly structural because people don't know their disadvantage, but the end result, what you're recounting, is much more an emotional response on the part of both groups. So in some ways, the project is much more, it sounds like, about creating this kind of affective response than simply who wins and who doesn't, because that's sort of maybe the more obvious part. That's very, I mean, so that's, if I'm understanding correctly, that seems to me an enormous payoff to let people sort of deal with the emotional response they have once they've engaged with your work.
I think in general, like that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make the project, because I think the concept of social privilege is so difficult sometimes to talk about, because in order to really understand it, you have to understand it on a structural level, but then also on an individual level. And so I wanted to create that system, but still make it really intimate, right? And escape rooms are intimate experiences because they're small group problem solving things. And you have actual emotions of like frustration and confusion and delight and achievement. And so it was like all about how to make this sort of emotional metaphor.
Well, I think I'm struck, Margaret, that your characters are similarly multidimensional in that way, and that they encounter historical and structural forms of oppression that change over time, and yet they're all very individualized in the way that they respond to those constraints, and they have emotional responses and intellectual responses that are not uniform across time at all. And I was particularly struck by the character that I really found very fascinating in your first novel, A Kind of Freedom. And I do want to ask you what you mean by the title, A Kind of Freedom, which is an intriguing title. But the character of Jackie, who is, again, a woman of a very particular generation and a generational story, but you describe her as this kind of very strong character in many ways, who's holding things together. But then she turns out to be racked with this kind of, to me at least, very recognizable kind of indecision. And you say about her, she's constantly sort of second guessing herself. And you say, normally she, that's Jackie, couldn't order a meal without questioning herself. Even deciding which movie to watch pained her. Suddenly each future minute would feel too worthy to undermine with an imperfect choice. Seems to me a very modern kind of dilemma. And then when she makes a big decision, you describe her as having, in a sense, quite a different response, kind of succumbed to the decision to reunite with her husband. And I wonder, you seem to be especially interested in women and their responses to justice and injustice, but also the choices they make in the excerpt you read, and also their own moments of indecision and insecurity. And I wonder if that relates to A Kind of Freedom. I don't know how it all fits together, but maybe you can help us.
Well, it's interesting. And so in A Kind of Freedom, so with the revisioners, as time elapsed, the characters did have access to more choices and more freedom and more agency. Okay. In A Kind of Freedom, it was the opposite. In A Kind of Freedom, we have the story of 3 generations of a New Orleans family. We start out in 1940s in the Jim Crow South with Evelyn, and then we have Jackie in the 1980s in the midst of the war on drugs, and then we have her son in post-Katrina New Orleans in 2010, and he's in and out of jail on drug charges. So the point of that book was, you would expect Evelyn, who's in her 20s in 1940s New Orleans in the Jim Crow South, you would expect that to be the bottom of the track in terms of the family's evolution. You would expect her to start there, and then Jackie would do better than she did, and then TC would do better than his mother. And yet it was the opposite. The trajectory was downward from Evelyn, and the idea was that was because without Jim Crow, we had other systems that came in to do equally pernicious work, and actually in some cases more damaging work. So Jackie's kind of sandwiched in the middle there. Like, Evelyn is presented as this relatively polished character. Her father is a doctor. She's this Creole woman in New Orleans who's relatively insulated from racism. And Jackie grew up with that mother. She grew up in this very, also relatively sheltered environment, but she meets this man who is a victim of structural oppression. And he's he gets addicted to crack cocaine in the 80s when we have the war on drugs and the mishandling of that epidemic. And because of that, it's almost like she's exposed to that unequal aspect of society in a way that she would have been privileged from it otherwise because of her mother. She's exposed to it. And so she's kind of sandwiched there. Like, we see her as this modern woman because she has had these relative advantages. She can't make a decision about food. She can't make a decision about the television. And yet, she's also like succumbing to this massive decision to reunite with this man who's going to send her and her son on this downward trajectory because of his victimization and because of his vulnerability to the system. And I do like to focus on women. TC is obviously a character in the book who's a man, but otherwise I do like to focus on women. I think it's because I'm a woman. I think, I was raised by my mom, my grandmothers, my aunts in this village of women. Of course, my dad too, but there were a lot of women in my life who were sort of at the helm. And I'm just fascinated by the ways in which the many Black women in my life have made different kinds of decisions and have just handled, they're all exposed to a certain degree of oppression as Black women in this country, and they've all kind of managed it differently and like tried to avoid it differently. And I just like to look at the different ways in which this has been confronted. This oppression has been confronted in this society, and the ways in which Black women have learned to rise above it.
Yeah, it's really apparent, and it's what makes, I think, A Kind of Freedom a kind of heart-wrenching read by the end, is that idea that the kind of freedom turns out to be not so much freedom, despite the theoretical freedom in practice doesn't turn out to look like, at least if freedom is slavery's opposite, and some tellings, in this case, it really isn't, right? It's not a diametrically opposed set of values.
Yes, I can tell you about the title.
Yeah, please.
So the original title for A Kind of Freedom was Early in the Morning. Yeah, and I think the idea there was, this is a long time ago, this is 5 years ago, but the idea there was, you have all of this promise early in the morning, and then you get to the end of the day and things are different, things look different. But no one at my publishing house could remember the name of the book. They would call it like, late in the evening, right before sunrise. It was all these different variations of this book. And finally, my editor was like, that's a problem that no one can remember this title. And he was like, go back and think about another title. And so that's how it's an Edward P. Jones. It's taken from an Edward P. Jones short story. Yeah.
But both titles are about temporality, though. I mean, they're both about what happens over time. And that seems to be one of the through strains here with these generations and things, that choice and time have an intimate kind of relationship to each other. Well, I'm not going to ask too many more questions. I might have one or two more, but then I want to make sure that we have time for our audience. And there are already some in the queue, but please send your questions now. Think about what do you want to know while you have this chance from either Risa or Margaret. And Risa, I have one more question. I'm just wondering about, again, back to the relationship between your choices and the choices that your subjects make. You have all these wonderful objects in many of your works. The cookie baking, I don't know how you did that, but aside from that, all the sort of sculptural elements of these different games. Do you provide rules to the games to your participants? And I'm curious why you do or don't. And do you craft them so that it's explicit what to do with them? They look like some games that are recognizable, but they're clearly not the games we all grew up playing either. And I'm wondering about how you use those objects in relation to your subjects and how you make them too.
Well, first of all, my family nickname is Miss Rules. Like, actually, that is my family nickname. So there's that. But in terms of, one of the things I like about games, right, is that there are often, there's the goal, right? Like the success, the win state, whatever. And then you have, challenges, obstacles to that success, and then the rules of engagement, right? And sometimes those rules of engagement are determined by the other players. For example, a very simple sort of infinite game is hitting a beach ball up in the air, right? And the goal being to just not let it hit the ground. And people can jump in and they can do it, and they can, make their own rules, being like, nobody can hit it 2 times in a row, or whatever, right? Or you can only hit it with one hand, or while standing on one foot, right? So those are kind of the flexible things. And I think of those as, those aren't as structural, as an underpinnings, right? Those might be structure, but structure that's on top, like the drywall, right? Not the foundation of it. I do create foundational, or at least a structure that makes you assume things. Like with good faith and fair dealing, there was something that said start and something that said finish. I did not, I made it specifically so that I wouldn't post rules. One, because I don't want people to have to read something to have to participate. And then also because I wanted people to decide, do they want to compete? Do they want to cooperate? With the privilege of escape, it's a little more complicated. And so the way we onboarded people is the person in the lab co would have a clipboard and take them through orientation the way you would if you were doing a study, right? That says the rules of the study, and this is what you're doing. And, as you know, at the Institute, we study behavioral science and the effect of, test conditions on performance or whatever it was, right? And so, but so I think it depends, it all depends. But I always do have sort of bumpers or rails in mind for sort of what is in play. Right? What decisions, there's always a freedom, but it's a kind of freedom, right? It's you are you're allowed to make a certain number of choices within the system, right? And then you can try to find success within that. I did a miniature golf course called the Course of Emotions that where each hole presented an emotional obstacle to overcome. And there was this one hole, despair, that was like a cylinder, and the hole was right on top, so it's you can't putt up the side, a vertical side of a thing. But what happened is people started making their own rules. They ended up borrowing a putter from somebody else, or 2 people would each try and do it, which kind of speaks to how you need your friends' help to get through despair sometimes, And so I think, and I think the idea is also to think about how do we, how can we, especially in a game like the Privilege of Escape, how can we restructure things to make it better, right? And sometimes there'd be people in who had played with the full spectrum light being very few people, honestly, very few people, but they would be how much disadvantage does the red light cause? Can you quantify that in minutes? And had I been in the room, cause I'm listening, fuming away with my headphones, and I wanted to be how many minutes are okay? How many minutes are you okay with, And so thinking about how do we reduce that, and can we make up for it have being a rigged game, right? Because the point of a rigged game is to make it so that one group continues to succeed, that one group continues to stay on top, right? Like in my game, at the end, we gave people candy if they finished first, like, because I'm horrible. And for me, that was like economic privilege, right? Like, and so while technically social and economic privilege are different, they're really, really tied together. Like usually if you had the social privilege, you also got the economic privilege, right? And, you know, are you willing to share your candy?
Right. And that's, of course, what sometimes real social science sometimes doesn't get to, real studies, is that kind of experiential quality. There's a quantifiable element that's important, certainly, but sometimes we do miss the kind of lived experience quality, which in some ways, I think both of you are trying to get to. I have so many more things I want to ask you, but I feel like I must go to some of the questions because they're really interesting too. And I'm just seeing them start to roll in. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to switch a little bit directions, and please do, if you want to get on the queue, this is your moment. But I will turn to some of these now. And this one is a very quick one just for Risa, because it's almost basically a yes or no. But as somebody who's obviously a fan already says, are there plans to bring any of your work to Southern California?
Nothing that I could say publicly, but tomorrow I actually have a meeting with an institution in San Diego to hopefully have something this year. So maybe.
Oh, that's the right moment to ask this. Great. I hope so. Okay. And here's a question really for both of you that reads as follows. Both of our artists tonight have given me a strong sense of art as disruption and experience, as challenging or changing the status quo. Any thoughts about that? Thank you, Margaret Wilkerson Sexton and Risa Puno. And I think, Margaret, maybe you'll start for us. Do you have any thoughts about that idea of sort of what art does in terms of disruption, social change?
Yeah, that's a really good way to say it. I never thought about it quite like that in terms of it being disruptive, but that is the goal, actually. Whenever I start a project, I don't think about, it's usually not the characters that draw me. It's usually an experience that I want to change, or something I've observed that I think is unfair, that I think needs to change. And so, you know, I've talked about what that was in A Kind of Freedom, and I've talked about what that was in The Revisioners, but even in this book I'm working on now, which is called The Roof, I learned that there was an urban renewal project in San Francisco in the late 50s and 60s that totally dislocated thousands of Black people, designated the neighborhood as blight, and then totally tore down a lot of the buildings, a lot of the businesses that were owned, a lot of the housing where Black people were living, and they were all dislocated, thousands of them, almost 13,000. And I didn't know about that. It's so similar to current gentrification patterns that we're seeing across the country. And so that's another thing I like to do. I like to find something that's a problem, but something that's still a problem. So something that was a problem in the past and something that's currently a problem. And I like to draw parallels between them. And it, like, on the surface, these juxtaposed patterns, because there's so much time between them, will look very distinct. But I like to present them in a way through my novels where you actually kind of lose time and you're like, oh, this situation that was happening in 1924 could actually be happening in 2017. We're kind of like losing track of where we are because the situations and the themes and the dynamics are so similar. And so, yeah, I like to disrupt patterns that I think are, devastating to society, especially with regard to race. And I like to identify where they started, and I like to show them together so that we can see how little has changed, and so that we can start to facilitate the process of changing it through tracking it back to the root.
Thank you. Risa, do you want to say anything on this front?
I mean, I would like to echo a little bit of Margaret's process in that I do think about it. It's like, I don't look to disrupt for disruption's sake. I mean, that would be weird for Miss Rules, I guess, to do that. But it's like, but I do absolutely look at it as a problem solving thing, right? And so if the status quo is problematic, then yes, I'm there to disrupt, I'm there to try and change. And so I think it is for me also more focused on problems that I see and want to help with.
Well, I'm going to go next to, there are a bunch of questions, not surprisingly, that people want to know more about your techniques too, not just about the larger impulses, but how you do what you do. And so I might kind of group these, if this is okay, because there are quite a few. And these, I'll start with a group of questions for Risa that are all really about how you make what you make. And then I have a similar kind of one that's just come up from Margaret too. The first one asks about the design and ergonomics of the projects, and said, the person wrote, "These are incredible. How much time, resources, creative thinking do you dedicate to designing the visual and ergonomic features? Did you partner with a visual designer for these projects? Truly wonderful. Thank you." That's one of them. Then somebody else wants to know, "I noticed that your works are all experiments, but experiments geared not towards generating scientific conclusions, but rather offering instructive experiences for participants. Could you speak to how you do that?" Then there's another question too about this sort of the after part. What was the offboarding process? The video showed a verbal discussion with the two groups facilitated by the actor. Did the participants also fill out forms or formally submit any post-experience feedback? So some people want to know about the objects, some want to know about the afterwards. And there was one more, let me see if I can find it, that had sort of a similar one. Risa, though you work in very physical space, have the limitations of COVID-safe activities inspired any virtual works that address the kinds of societal issues you explore? I'm glad somebody asked that. It's how can one think about anything but these days, right? So those are some sort of maker questions for you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as far as the physical object, I mean, first of all, for the Privileged Escape, there were so many partners. We had a director, scriptwriter helping out. We had amazing actors who were courageous. We had lighting designers, a sound designer, a puzzle tech, consultant. We had social justice collaborators. And then on top of it, Creative Time's amazing staff. And so there were a lot of people involved, but in terms of the design, the visual design, that was actually on me. We worked with fabricators, but I drew up, drawings, on paper, Illustrator. I mean, I'm pretty low tech, so I always start with a mechanical pencil on graph paper and then move to Illustrator. And in this case, I did actually move to SketchUp. I'm just kind of slow. But I do think about the language of objects, right? I think about ergonomics. I think about how we understand things. And then there was also just the idea of being delighted by oversized things. It sort of, again, is a little bit disarming. And also having big wooden blocks is so much harder to drag back and forth to the light. That was a consideration too. It's I didn't actually want it to be easy. I wanted to emphasize how hard that was and how easy it was to just flip them in place in the room with the white light. So for a lot of my projects in the past, for Good Faith and Fair Dealing, I actually constructed that with my own hands, and baked the cookies, obviously with help. But the construction of the Privileged Escape was with a lot of help, but the design was definitely me. I mean, my aesthetic tends to be like that. Mm-hmm. And then, sorry, I'm already forgetting all the other maker questions. I guess maybe the COVID one.
Yeah, that was the last one was sort of how do any of these projects work, or have you made anything in our special times, or have you made anything that responds to this moment and our new strange social behavior?
Yeah, it's been a challenge for sure, especially somebody who does a lot of work where you bring people physically closer together as a metaphor for social connection. Mm-hmm. And so it's well, can I do the opposite? Can I flip that around? I don't know. And so thinking about that and thinking about what is at the heart of the games I'm making? And it is about giving people choices and giving them opportunities, because every time you make a choice, you're essentially expressing your values, right? Your values based on the assumptions of what you know around you and the circumstances. And I don't know whether you feel safe or whether you feel allowed to, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about that. I've been playing around a lot with RPGs, role-playing games. Like I've gotten into like Dungeons and Dragons, even though, I mean, I'm really into the idea of the collective storytelling. I am not so into the whole manifest destiny, like colonization, like solving everything through violence thing. Like that's not my deal. But I do like that you're still crafting an experience together, even if it's through words. And so I actually teamed up with a friend who was the lighting designer on The Privilege of Escape, Avi Dobkin, and we wrote our own RPG called The Quiet. And you can find it on Onassis's website, onassis.org. They commissioned it as a micro commission. And basically it's like a one-on-one, like somebody plays the narrator, somebody plays the character, and it's like kind of low tech. I mean, you can do it over Zoom, but you can also just do it over the phone. And they like take you through this adventure and they run the thing for you and present you situations. You make choices and then they present you with what happened afterward and you just go through it like that. And it touches on a lot of the themes of like happening, like especially regarding the COVID time, right? Like about safety and guardianship and sort of this social contract that we're in. So exploring different things, trying, because, my previous work is basically Dr. Fauci's worst nightmare. So trying to work it out.
I think it'll be fascinating to see how artists of all kinds end up responding to this moment, from choreographers to novelists and onwards. I mean, the exacerbated inequalities, the fear about physical contact with others there. I mean, there's so many dimensions. I think there's probably a whole new wave of work to come. I'm going to ask a somewhat similar question now for Margaret, and then there are one or two sort of more philosophical questions to come back to, and then I'm afraid we'll run out of time. So for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to this question for Margaret, which is an interesting one too. And it says, I find it very interesting that you say you have a thesis for your novels before you begin them. In what ways do you find that fiction allows you to convey your thesis more effectively than, say, nonfiction? Can we relate this choice to Risa's choice in creating games? Are you also trying to make your readership participate in order to learn?
Wow, what a great question. And it's just a great way of wording it.
Yeah. By a literature scholar, you won't be surprised.
Okay. Well, I think, first and foremost, I think creating it through fiction, examining the thesis through fiction makes it more interesting for me. I don't think I would ever sit down and write nonfiction and enjoy it. But being able to do it through the characters, it takes me into a world that helps me, that just helps me escape and just helps me access different aspects of the human condition, which is really useful for me. Like, I feel like with characters like Josephine, for instance, and I read a little bit from her section, but you could probably glean that she's a very wise and very dignified older woman. When we find her in her 70s in 1924, this is the woman you want to go to, to get tea and to get banana bread and to get advice and to get a hug. And I feel like writing that character, I don't know if I was able to write her because I had access to her, or I'm not sure what the order is, but because I wrote her, following the writing of her, I now have access to that character, which is interesting to me. Like, it's, and a lot of authors will say that, but it feels like it's a real person that you're channeling. And so sometimes I'll actually be able to ask myself, like, what would Josephine do? And I can feel I can access a part of that person's spirit. So there's that. And then I think there's also just an advantage for the readers. I think readers really learn through being able to evoke empathy. And so when my readers are reading about a character like TC, for instance, who's in and out of jail on drug charges, he's in his 20s, he's in New Orleans. That's a character that I love. I based that character on someone I know, and I love the person I based it on, and I love that character. And so I was able to present that character lovingly. So despite the fact that he's had to make all of these choices that are damaging for his life, this is a really good human. And I think it enables people who are not in that world, who don't know anybody like TC the way I do, to try to imagine what it would be like to grow up in circumstances that would lead you down a track that's almost inevitably going to cause harm. And I'll never forget my father-in-law, who is in his 60s and he's a white man. he told me one of my characters that he could relate to the most was TC. And you would think that these two people would have very little in common. But that's the point of my writing. I'm trying to get people to find the commonality between themselves and people who are very different from them, so that when they're encountering people on the street who are like TC or who are like whomever, Jackie or Jackie's husband, they can kind of re-examine how they want to treat them. They can re-examine the policies that are governing these people's lives. They could have it kind of creep in and help them make decisions that'll be more advantageous for that demographic.
It's apparent to me that you're kind to your characters. I mean, your love for your characters is evident in some ways, because even the character of TC, it is quite clear that the reader is left with great affection for this character, and because you've somehow infused that into the story. That's interesting that you see that as one of your explicit goals.
Thank you. I do.
It's evident.
Thank you.
There's a last but big question, but I think it ends us in an interesting place. And I'm going to read it to you now. Oppression and privilege can shape not just choice, but also desire and preference. How we see ourselves will affect what we want, and the choices we wish to pursue, not just the ones we do pursue, which may be determined by the limits of our options. Can each of you talk about how your work engages this phenomenon? That's a kind of hard question to take in immediately, but this question about how privilege and oppression shape the desires in the first place, not just the choices you make, but what you might think you want, if I'm understanding that correctly, and which ones you wish to pursue, not which ones you do pursue. And does your work engage with that in any way? And that's really a question for either or both of you.
I can speak to it, or I can.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, it makes me think of my character Ava, who's a biracial woman in New Orleans in 2017. This is a woman who never met her white father. She was raised by her, well, she's met him, but it's a very distant relationship, and she probably doesn't remember meeting him. Mm-hmm. And she was raised by her Black mother, and she's always, with everything in her, desired to be accepted by her white side of the family. And so that rejection and that oppression by the family, and just by greater white society, kind of fuels her decision to move in with her white grandmother. She's still trying to get in with that side of the family. And I don't think I know she doesn't realize, but I hope the readers realize, like, this is not necessarily a functional choice. This is coming from oppression. This is coming from oppression within the family. This is coming from greater oppression. And it's only when Ava is able to realize the advantage of the Black side of her family and kind of reconcile the absence of the white side, that she can truly access that authentic power in her that comes from her ancestors, Josephine, Winnie, etc. But I think that's what came to my mind initially, just like these dysfunctional choices that we sometimes make that are formed almost entirely by dysfunction, by oppression. And it could be, small instances of oppression. It could be like more global instances of oppression. But Ava, to me, is a good example of that, how her need to assimilate came from the rejection of the white side of the family.
Interesting. Yeah. So that definitely, I think, does reflect that kind of double layer of what you think you want as well as what you do, right? And Risa, it strikes me that in some ways, you're asking, when you ask people to participate in your games in the first place, you're asking them a first question: do you want to do this? I mean, I might be nervous in some ways about participating in an escape room. To me, that sounds a little terrifying, and I don't know what that says about me, but that's
we totally turned that up. We totally turned that up too. I mean, we made very dramatic lighting, and the sound was this spaceship HVAC in the background to make you feel like it was cavernous. I mean, you can totally tweak people's things. So we did that on purpose. But I think in terms of what people want based on the choices and options and the things they see forward, I think it absolutely plays into it, because I think the people in room A with the full spectrum light were like trying to win, and they were like, how fast can we get this done? And the people in room B were like, can we get this done? Like, can we get this done at all? And success at that point is almost like just not giving up, right? Like, because that actually happened. We saw somebody like just sort of like lay down in the room and just be like, I didn't know, and so it's I think that absolutely, like the circumstances determine what people want and what they're going after. I mean, something that I had considered in the game design was like whether or not systemic change should be allowable in the game. Like I had this whole flow chart, yes or no. If yes, is it optional or is it mandatory? If it's optional, is it something they have to work for or something they sacrifice for? And if it's something they sacrifice for, what do you value enough in an escape room in order to feel like it's a sacrifice? And like had this whole plan and then took it to our like social justice collaborators and they were like, Risa, this is kind of like white saviorism. And I was like, crap. So I threw it out. But it's thinking about things like that. Like, cause only one person in the room said like who was waiting, watching the people fail. Only one person out of 3,000 people was like, should we help them? Like, can we help them? And then it became a thing. Like I was actually filling in for the actor that day. And so I was like that, what would you want if you were them? Because it's like in an escape room, it's also like, you have to be conscious. Like people don't necessarily just like want you to give them answers, right? That's the whole thing. You have to ask what people need and find out, right? Because just what you think isn't necessarily what they want, right? And so there's what they want as an overall goal, what they want in terms of assistance. And I don't know, like the question that we ended, and you saw it in the video, but I'll repeat, the question we ended the privilege of escape on was, this concludes the first phase of the Institute's research. In the next phase, we'll be asking the question, if you know that the game is unfair, will you work together to change it? And I think that's something, right? Because it's like, if you benefit from that rigged system, are you going to do anything to change it?
That's a very good place to end. That might be a question for all of us and for our audience too. What will you do this year to change things? Thank you both so much. That was a terrifically interesting presentation and conversation. And thank you to our audience for the wonderful questions. This was a real pleasure, at least for me. And so best to everyone, and please come back for our next set of programs. And thank you again to Risa and Margaret for joining us this evening. Bye all.